Dates are a funny thing, aren't they? You know, you can go decades with certain dates on the calendar not meaning anything, and then all of a sudden they really do mean something. This Valentine's Day, I was driving up to my mom's, and she's about a 6-hour drive away. And about an hour into the drive, she called and said, I don't think you should come. I'm not feeling well. And I said, well, of course I'm going to come. So I kept driving. And about another hour later, she called and said, no, I really don't think you should come. I've been throwing up all morning, and I don't think I'm ready for guests. I said, Mom, come on. It's just me. How about I take you to the hospital when I get there? And I know you've got a terrible flu. Let's get you hydrated. You'll feel much better. She agreed. Another hour into the drive, and I'm almost there, I get a call, and it's from Linda. And Linda is my mom's downstairs neighbor who happens to be a nurse. And she said, Heath, I'm up at your mom's and I don't like the way she's looking, so I'm going to go ahead and call an ambulance. We both agreed that it was probably still the flu. And so I went straight to the hospital and met the doctors in emergency. And yep, they agreed. Flu, dehydration, 83, bad combination. And so after pumping her full of fluids, they sent her home. And that night, I was making dinner, and I happened to be walking by her room, and she wasn't in her bed. And so I saw she was coming out of her bathroom. And as she was walking toward the bed, she went very pale, and she started to go down. And I scooped her, got her onto the bed just in time, and she was out cold. So I called the ambulance again. And by the time they got there, she had revived enough to give them crap about the fact they were showing up again just to see her again. And then she had enough wherewithal to wave at the neighbors as she was being wheeled out to the ambulance. And we got to the hospital, and we didn't leave again for 2.5 weeks. 3 GI scopes, CT scan, MRI, multiple lab tests, lots of pokes and prods. And finally, Dr. Lovely, who I named Dr. Lovely, that's not her real name, came in and held my mom's hand and said, it's not what we'd hoped. And the diagnosis they gave her was metastatic cancer in the small intestine, and it had spread everywhere. So indeed, it wasn't flu at all. And she was so sweet. I mean, she gave us all the options, and what that made us understand is we didn't really have a lot of options. My mom wasn't well enough to undergo surgery or the chemo, and so we sat down and made the decision to go home. And at first, my sister had always said she was going to care for my mom in her late stages when she needed it. And so we started making arrangements for my mom to go to Calgary to my sister's house. And my mom said no. She wanted to be at her condo. And her condo has a view of the golf course, lake, the mountains. It's beautiful. So I get it. If I had days or weeks to live, it's where I would have wanted to be too. The problem is that my sister lives in Calgary, I live in Seattle, and my other sister lives in Vancouver. So it posed just a little bit of complexity. But that lasted about 2 seconds, and we just knew what we needed to do. So my sister and I moved in, set up an air mattress, and split 24-hour shifts in caretaking for my mom. You know, it went fast and it didn't. I can remember one of her good friends coming to the door on the first week she was home, and then walking her to the door on her next visit about 5 weeks later. And I was saying to her, oh my gosh, I think she looks really good. Don't you think she looks really good? Like there's hardly been any change. And she just goes, Heath, no, sweetheart, there's been a lot of change. And I kind of just hadn't seen it. But then when I look at it, it was shortbread cookies and coffee and robust banter. And then very quickly it was subcutaneous meds and cannabis ice cream. So it did kind of go fast. And as hard as it was, hardest thing I've ever done, there were moments of levity. There was one time when her doctor, Dr. Curry, this tall, dark drink of water, came to visit. And at the end of the visit, she said, "Dr. Curry, would you like to get in for a little snuggle?" And then another time there was a home care nurse who took my sister Cynthia and I aside and said, "Your mother must have been such a nurturing, caring, sweet, sweet mother to have raised two girls like you who are caring for their mother in the way that you are." And my sister and I just went, huh? Because my mother's a lot of things, but nurturing and sweet were not two of the adjectives most commonly used. Hilarious and strong and confident and funny and just passionate and interesting. Those were all adjectives for her, but sweet and nurturing, not so much. So we're not sure where we got it. But the funniest probably was right near the end. My sister and I set up 2 bar stools on either side of the bed to make a bed for us, like that was going to work. So of course at 3 o'clock in the morning, we're still wide awake and moonlight is streaming in through the window. And I look at her and I said, "Sin, you got a little glitter there." And she looked at me, 5-day-old clothes and hair going every which way. And she said, "It's 'cause I'm so fancy." And we laughed so hard. You know, I became a Christian in the 7th grade at Camp Furwood up in Bellingham, Washington. And I remember crawling out of my cabin early one morning and walking down to the beach and making my commitment to follow the Lord. And the relationship's been hilly. It's not been an easy spiritual journey. It's been up and down, and sometimes he's been my closest confidant and other times more of a Facebook acquaintance. But during that time, I felt his presence so close. And there are gifts that he delivered that I couldn't possibly have done on my own. Gifts of patience, perseverance. Patience at 3 a.m. when I didn't think I could clean up after my mom one more time. Perseverance when me and my sister's very different personalities maybe weren't connecting like they should be. I'm not easy to live with. I'll give her that. But more than that, there's been a couple times in my life when the Lord has used the fire to refine me, to polish and shape during times of crisis, and this was one of those. He does this really great thing where he just walks behind me and he bends down and he takes the carpet and he just gives it a little tug. So I drop every ball that's in the air. And then he comes alongside me and he says, "Okay, which balls are we going to pick up?" And it's always been very powerful times in my life when I've made that connection that I'm pushing, doing my thing, and I'm not including him in the process. And it was during this time with my mother that I was starting a new business, and I'm a type A with an agenda, and I had conferences booked and trips booked and speeches and coaching clients and all sorts of stuff. I just had to let every single ball drop to the ground because she was what was important. And that came so clear. It was on a spring day, beautiful spring day, when my mother died. And the window was open and the warm air was coming in and we had Il Divo blasting on the radio, and each of her 3 daughters held a piece of her as she took her last breath. And my oldest sister looked at me through tears streaming down her face and she said, "Is she gone?" And I said, "Yeah, she's gone." And she said, "I'm so happy for her." I said, "Yeah, me too." And you are sometimes when people are in pain or they're not in their normal bodies or they look so uncomfortable, but it doesn't change that space, that crater that's created when someone leaves you. So I was going to talk to you today about grief, and I can come at it from a very cerebral sort of academic space, but I'm actually going to come at it from more of an orphaned daughter space. So what I'm going to share with you is just a few unsuspecting symptoms of grief and some wellness-minded options for applying to that grief. My friend Jenny read a book on grief, and it talked about cultures that wail. You know, ugly crying for hours or days. And it talked about how potentially those people process through this grief a little differently, quicker, more effectively. And I get that. Our body is going to push out that stress some way, somehow. And I think because we, as a culture, aren't encouraged to express to that degree, being as demonstrative in our feelings as other cultures might be, and perhaps we hide it in a shoulder, put it in our hands, excuse it to the bathroom, or just stuff it, it's going to find a way out in different ways. And that's what I found, was these unsuspecting signs of grief. I was at the mall the other day, and I was doing some returns, but Tommy Bahamas was having a sale, so I popped in, and I love their bathing suits, so I was flipping through the suits on the rack, and of course, because they were on sale, they only had size 0 and 2. So it was a short stint in Tommy's, and I left. And I get all the way down the hallway, and all the way down the other hallway, and my phone rings. And you should know something, I don't carry a purse. So my phone, my wallet, my keys are always just right in my hand. And so I look down, and there's my phone, my wallet, my keys, and a hanger with size 0 bikini bottoms hanging off my finger. And so I laughed really hard, and then I called my husband, and he called me a felon. And then I sheepishly made my way back to Tommy's, and they very begrudgingly accepted my return. And I said to them, I have grief brain. When we are hit with such a huge event, our brain triages. It only has so much capacity to process at any one time. And some of the minutiae, like returning a hanger to its rack, is going to go by the wayside. So forgetfulness and just foggy brain is a very common symptom, although maybe unexpected in some. My friend Tony approached me at one point and said, how's it going? About a month after she died. And I said, it's okay. And Tony has experienced grief like no one should ever have to. The amount of loss he's endured makes him the best kind of person to be facing when you want to talk about how you're feeling, because he gets it. And he said, how's the fatigue? And I said, oh my gosh, you're absolutely right. I said I hadn't identified that deep core concrete block in my chest was grief fatigue. It's different than when you have kids up all night or you've worked 10 days in a row. It's just different. It's a different immobilization. And I think sometimes we maybe forget that that's what it's about. It's an emotional fatigue. Pain. My sisters and I all had knee pain after my mother died. And it was very odd because none of us really had a particular injury. And so I did some research on it. And there's a study out of UCLA that determined that the anterior cingulate cortex of our brain processes emotional and pain, physical pain, emotional pain and physical pain, very close together in the same little spot in your brain. So those wires get crossed sometimes. And on occasion, we process emotional pain as physical pain. We get the pain of a broken heart, right? We get that stabbing feeling. We know what that, we're familiar with that. But sometimes the pain is going to express in a different way. So just to be aware of that. I love to travel, and I'm a seasoned traveler, but I'm still that guy that gets off the train and lands on the platform and is going to run over your toes with my bag, and I've left my passport on the train and I go left instead of right. I'm disoriented as a traveler. It's different visual happening. I'm not in my space. I'm disoriented. And my sister went to a grief counselor, and the counselor said to her, Jenny, there's a whole reframing process that has to happen. When you have someone that close to you leave your life, your landscape has just completely changed. And it is got to be unfamiliar and predictably disorientating. And so that was kind of a relief for me, because I know what that feeling is like when I land in a new country and I'm completely out of it. And I felt like that during the initial stages of the grieving process. I was totally disoriented. And so now it makes sense. This one is not so much a symptom, it's more of an observation. I like to inline skate, and I've skated competitively before. I've done inline skating marathons. Yes, there are inline skating marathons. And I registered for my first one, and so I looked up inline skating marathon training schedule, and there was nothing. So I thought, well, I'm just going to download a normal training schedule for a marathon. How different can it be? And I followed it to the letter. So when the gun went off at the start, it took about 6 seconds for me to realize I had trained completely wrong. In a normal marathon, you pace yourself. You know, it's all about steady pace and, metering it out. In an inline skating marathon, it's more like a bike race. So the group starts, you break off into subgroups, you fall into line, and you start drafting. So suddenly someone's hand is on my butt, and I got my hand on their butt. And you're in this tight line, and it's heaven because all wind resistance is gone. It's easy. It's just like you could skate in a vacuum. It was fantastic. But the thing about drafting is there's a front man, and that front man is pulling the entire line of skaters. And so eventually they peel off, and then the next one peels off. And then suddenly you're faced with pulling a line of 15 to 20 skaters. Well, I hadn't trained for that. I hadn't trained for sprints, I'd trained for a marathon. And I've really found that the grief process is a series of sprints. It's not a marathon. And so what I mean by that is some days you'll wake up and you'll feel perfectly fine. No problems. And something you may recognize or not recognize happens, and suddenly it's like it just happened all over again. And you're hit like a truck. There's something I explain to my patients when they come in and they say, I don't know if this is getting better or not. I say, let's talk about the diff. And the diff is duration, intensity, frequency. So is your problem less frequent? Do you notice it twice a week instead of 6 times a week? Is it less intense? So is it a 6 out of 10 and not a 9 out of 10? When it comes, does it not last as long? So is it an hour instead of the whole day? That's how we tell if we're making progress. So in the grief process, although it is a series of sprints and they can be overwhelming, with time, the diff changes, the duration, the intensity, and the frequency. Those are the unsuspecting signs. And so now we're going to talk about the wellness-minded options. And there's lots we could talk about, but I picked the 5 that I think are the most effective. Starting with movement. And I don't mean sweaty exercise, I mean just moving. Walking, stretching, yoga, tai chi. Just getting that body moving. Because we have little proprioceptors in each of our joints, and when we move them, it signals the brain to dump happy hormones. And so although we may feel like we want to be curled up on the couch and not move, we want to be under the covers because we feel so bad, forcing ourselves to get up and just walk or move does tremendous for the physiology going on inside. Second one is creativity. Music, artwork, poetry, other writing, singing. All of those creative processes target a separate part of your brain that's not verbal. And there's a lot of us out there that don't know how to verbalize what we're feeling when we're going through grief. And so having another outlet helps push it outside, helps externalize it, helps us deal with it. And sometimes what you create, you looking back at it, helps you make sense of it too. So it's like a reflection of what's going on in your body that you might not be able to identify. So creativity, super key. The third is exercise. In this case, I do mean sweaty exercise. Dr. Mercola tells us that exercise acts as a problem solver. It dumps happy hormones like dopamine, serotonin. It decreases anxiety and depression. It helps sleep, and it gives you a sense of accomplishment. So even though we feel like we don't want to, if we can get in there and just get that heart rate up even for 5 or 10 minutes, it has an incredible value to getting through this process. 4, sleep. Now that's a conundrum because sleep's one of the first things that's affected by grief. So we have to up our sleep hygiene game. We've got to create a sleep cave that is impenetrable. So we want to create a black environment. And I mean like can't see your hand, black. So any light leakage into the room is going to be a hormone interrupter for those sleep hormones that are trying to kick in. And natural light leakage is much less of a problem than the junk light. So smoke detector behind me, dimmer switches, night lights, alarm clocks, all of that blue-green light suppresses your melatonin. And your melatonin is necessary to help you get into a sleep cycle. Distractions. Pets and kids. Can't have them. Well, you can have them. But you should try to limit the amount of time they spend in the bedroom when you're trying to sleep. The biggest one is tech, obviously, screen time. And so we want to stop 90 minutes before bed, but sometimes that's hard for us, right? So now there's some biohacks out there. There's screen light changes that we can do that come standard with most screens. There are also glasses that you can wear. There's these yellow glasses that knock out all junk light, and you can start wearing them partway through the day or before, a couple hours before bed. There's also these red glasses that literally make your eyes think they are in pitch black. And you can still function, but it's slowly starting that hormone cycle to get you prepared for sleep. So there's lots of stuff that you can do to create a better sleep environment, and you need it because when we're sleeping, our subconscious is working on things very deeply, and it's so beneficial. Feeding. I could tell you that feeding can either push you toward greater grief or push you toward a greater, quicker, more effective processing through that grief. If we nourish our bodies with really whole foods, clean, unprocessed foods, then all of our physiologic, biochemical things that need to go on to help our stress levels come down, to help us work through the emotional strain of grief are going to be way more efficient and effective. However, if we choose sugar, caffeine, food sensitivities, dairy, processed food, then those things all cause inflammation, anxiety, depression, sleep interruption, irritability. And that's like throwing gas on a fire because grief already causes all that stuff. So how you eat is imperative, but isn't it funny how when we are in times of stress, we give ourselves permission? I had a stressful day, I'm going to have a martini. I'm super sad, so I'm going to eat crappy today, but I'll start again tomorrow. Just remember that the grief process needs you to be conscientious about how you're feeding it if it's going to work effectively. Prayer. Prayer for me has been huge. People who know me well know my Bible is dusty too much of the time, but during times of stress, that brings a huge comfort for me. And a couple places to go if you're not familiar is Psalms. Super gentle, easy reading, very comforting. So I love that. And then prayer. So prayer and scripture. And so praying is an incredible way to unload a weight and a burden. And the Lord has just been so present in my life during this time. And I have felt the relief that comes from sharing this burden with Him. So I encourage you in that. And the final one is breathing. Breathing takes us from sympathetic to parasympathetic. So fight or flight, cool and calm. Fight or flight, cool or calm. And when we're in grief, our cortisol is dumping, all of our stress hormones are dumping, so we're kind of in fight or flight. Cool and calm is a whole different set of things. And the bridge between those two is breath work. That can push us from sympathetic to parasympathetic, right? Taking a big deep breath, always calming. So let's just go through a breathwork 101 lesson, and the breathing exercise is called a 4-7-8 breath. So what you're going to do is you're going to breathe in for 4, you're going to hold for 7, and you're going to release for 8. So take a breath in, hold for 7, and release for 8. Do that 10 times and things just seem to ground really well. So breathing in the moment is a great reliever of that grief stress. It's a great reliever in any time of stress or anxiety. So I encourage you to do that. My father died in 1997 of brain cancer, and his final wish was to have his ashes distributed at Shuswap Lake up in British Columbia. And so we did. We went up there and we distributed his ashes in front of this wonderful cliff with pictographs on it. And so it's no surprise that 2 weeks ago, myself, my sister Cynthia and Jenny, our partners Brent, Dean, and Keith, hopped on a houseboat and made the way 5 hours up the lake to the same cliff front with the pictographs, and we distributed her ashes there. And as her final wish, my husband made her a martini with olives and a stick and poured it in after her. Those rituals that we do when we've lost someone are amazing stitches in the fabric of closure, but there's still often a space there. And I love this quote. It says, we don't necessarily fully ever get over grief. We learn to live with it. We learn to accept it as a new normal, as a permanent companion. And eventually, with time, suddenly, the landscape is familiar again. Good luck.